Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. It's really a distinct honor and privilege tonight. We have a very distinguished panel. We've had a day-long set of off-the-record conversations. But again, welcome to all of you. I think we are going to have a great discussion, not only on the panel, but as usual, we'll pivot to the audience for your questions in the second half. This is the fifth of 5 convenings that we've done here at the Berkley Center over about the last calendar year, looking at the intersection of religion in various international issues. And the first of those was religion and the global refugee crisis. The second one was religion and global climate change. The third one was on religion and U.S. electoral politics. And not too far ago, we convened a meeting, on the rise of religion and the alt-right in the United States. And tonight, religion, governments, and preventing violent extremism, what have we learned is our topic. So the other thing I need to note is that we've been able to do these 5 convenings thanks to a grant from the Henry R. Luce Foundation. And we are particularly honored to have Toby Volkman with us here tonight and all day. Toby, where are you? There you are. Toby's in the back. Please, if you have a chance, say hello to her. But we're honored by your presence, and we thank you for the largesse of the foundation that's allowed us to do this series over the last year or so in a number of very interesting topics. I'm going to just pivot right to the panel because I think we've got such an interesting group, and I'm going to not offer my usual editorial comments on the state of the world. We have Dr. Mohammed El-Senussi, who is the Executive Director of the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, which is a global network that builds bridges between grassroots peacemakers and global players to work towards sustainable peace. Mohammed, it's great to see you as always. We also have Susan Hayward, who's a Senior Advisor for Religion and Inclusive Societies at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Hayward directs the Institute's efforts to advance conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation projects engaging the religious sector. We also have Hisham Hellier, who is a Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute in London, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East, and a senior fellow in Islamic Studies at Cambridge Muslim College. Welcome to both of you. And our moderator tonight is Professor Peter Mandeville, who is currently a Berkley Center Senior Research Fellow, as well as being a Brookings Institution non-resident fellow. He's also a professor of international affairs at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, where he previously served as co-director of the Ali Vural Akh Center for Global Islamic Studies and of the Center for Global Studies. And from 2015 to 2016, he was a senior advisor in the United States Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Please join me in welcoming our panel, and again, thank you all for coming.
Great. Well, good evening to all of you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Huge kudos to the panelists for passing the first test, which is to sit successfully without knocking over the glasses of water. So this is, we're already off to a very good start. So we have, I think, a really compelling set of issues that we're going to be exploring this evening. For many of you who have been following developments in the Middle East in particular, but in other regions of the world over the last 20 years, will know that there's been an ongoing debate and discussion about the phenomenon of violent extremism, the sources of it, what causes it, and how best to address it. Some of that discussion has focused on the issue of religion, and more specifically, the question of how important religion is and religious ideology as a causal factor in violent extremism, but also on the other side of the equation, as it were, a set of discussions about roles that religious actors and religious leaders can play in helping to address the challenge of violent extremism. And so this is the kind of terrain in which our discussion this evening is situated. I think it's a discussion that's happening at a very timely moment because we have in Washington currently an administration that has tended to place more emphasis on the idea that ideology is a significant factor. And I think that this has kind of brought renewed salience to the sorts of questions that we're going to be speaking to this evening. Just a brief note on format. I'm going to be asking each of our panelists a sort of initial kickoff question, and then we'll come back to each of them for a second follow-up question before turning to you, our audience, to bring your voices into the discussion. I think we're going to have microphones available to hear your questions. So I think I'm going to start with you, Hisham, if you don't mind. There's been now for the better part of 2 decades, and of course most recently with respect to ISIS, a debate about the role of religion or religious ideology as a causal factor in violent extremism. The current US administration, as I mentioned, has placed increased emphasis on ideology as a driver of extremism, and you, I know, are someone who has been observing and commenting on these issues for a long time. So I just wanted to ask, how do you see this question?
Well, first, thank you very much, Peter, and Sean, for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be a part of the panel and to touch on an issue that I've been working on myself for about 15 years. The conversation seems to go in cycles, so we address this question every few years and then we feel obliged to do it again. At the moment, I'm actually doing a project on 25 countries with different colleagues, mostly based in Europe, but also in Asia and Africa, looking at precisely this issue. It's an EU-funded project called Greece, which is an acronym for governing religion, radicalization, and secularism on these different continents. And I have to say, the idea of a singular process of radicalization, which is really what we're getting at, is something that isn't really backed up by the data. I think that we have a number of different types of processes that are actually unfolding, and it depends very much on geography, background, political circumstances, really across the board, right? So the notion of the problem being all about ideology, I think, is very problematic. And I think that there are many other factors that we have to consider far more than actually ideology or quote-unquote bad religion. Having said that, and this is where I think nuance needs to come into the equation a little bit, ideology does play a role in some cases. I would argue a minority of cases. That particularly affects those in the top echelons, as it were, of those types of movements and groups, but it exists and it needs to be identified properly. It needs to be analyzed authentically. But we can't simply demand that we come up with a singular equation as to how this all unfolds and then say, okay, this is one size fits all kind of solution. And I think that people find that very difficult, sometimes in academia, but definitely within policy. And this is the biggest problem, I think, that policymakers look for quick fix solutions and also very clear-cut, singular answers. And the situation is simply far more complex than that. So I wouldn't say that ideology has nothing to do with this. I think that that's dishonest. But I do think that far too often those who bring up ideology are the ones that are frankly looking for an excuse to avoid discussing the other massive elephants in the room. And I think that's particularly the case when we discuss this internationally, because it's then used as an excuse to back autocratic regimes of different types. And we've seen that many times in the last few years with various countries within the Arab world and the wider region.
Those regimes being essentially the elephants in the room that you're referring to.
In this particular case, yeah.
Okay,
so we, again, it's sometimes difficult because one doesn't want to let autocracy get away with it, right? So we do focus on that, and we ought to. And at the same time, recognize that ideology does play a role for some people and energizes them in ways that other factors do not. But again, I think that this is really a minority of the entirety of the problem.
Okay. Let me turn to you, Susie. So much of the discussion around religion and CVE tends to focus on Islam or on militant groups that define themselves in relation to Islam. But of course, there are settings today in which movements affiliated with other faith traditions are implicated in violent extremism. You, I know, have done a lot of work on Buddhism and militancy in Myanmar. And so I wonder if you could give us a sense of what that looks like and how it compares to some of the cases we tend to be more familiar with.
Yeah. I would first be quick to point out that a lot of the movements that we think of in Myanmar when you ask this question, so Mabata or 969 or corollary movements like in Sri Lanka, the Bodhabala Sena, are distinctive from some of the traditional movements we think of that give an Islamic justification or groundedness, such as Daesh, or some of the more historic violent extremist movements that have an ideological bent to it, whether it's the LTTE in Sri Lanka or the IRA, in the sense that these groups are not necessarily using violence as a means by which to achieve some sort of religious or ideological end, which is not to say that they're not using tactics and language that fuels violence, but only to say that it's not part of their tactic. They don't have a violent campaign, a militant campaign that's central to what they're seeking to do. But if we think more broadly, beyond just the traditional definition of a terrorist organization or a violent extremist organization, to the broader parameters of religion and conflict, or a religious conflict, then these groups do have some similarities to the traditional violent extremist groups, which can include things like, it does include things like anxiety about modernity, about globalization, about processes of secularization, and particularly with that last one, rooted in the colonial experience and the almost overnight separation between the pagoda and the state, and the sense that the health of the state and the health of the religious community depended on that relationship. So the severing of that, and then the almost enforced forms of secularization that resulted through colonialism continues to drive this anxiety that fuels these movements and their activities, as well as the aspects of exclusionary mentalities, fear of the religious other, the ethnic other to a degree, an obsession with women's bodies and women's sexuality, and desire to control women's sexuality and their bodies, and in the midst of all of this, employment of particular religious ideas, teachings, historical experiences, in order to frame and understand and interpret the contemporary situation and what is needed in order to defend the faith, to defend the Dharma, in a notion that's somewhat akin to a just war theory that we might see in other traditions. They're also, I would say, very responsive to the specter of violent extremism within the Muslim world. So there's a lot of responsiveness to what they see in the media, to what they see around them in Asia, in a way that almost makes them mimic to some degree what they're seeing, but also fuels their own anxieties. And what drives these groups in particular, these Buddhist groups in particular, is an anxiety that's rooted also in recognition that the Buddhist world does not have the same degree of influence, power, global domination, and so on, as the Christian world and the Muslim world. So it's also driven by that sense of existential threat that then leads them to feel that this is an extraordinary moment where we might need to break some of our traditional ethical norms in order to ensure the continued existence of the Buddhist faith. So there's some similarities, especially in terms of the mentalities and what's driving this sort of religious anxiety or religious interpretation of the movement that has violent repercussions, exclusionary repercussions to it, but it also has some qualitative differences in the sense of where they see violence, the role that violence can or should play, and whether violence should be a focused tactic in order to achieve these religious ends of defending the faith.
Okay, great, thank you. If I may now, I wanted to kind of pivot the conversation towards the other side of the equation. That is the idea of religious leaders being part of the solution. And turning to you now, Mohammed, I know you play a very important role in a global network, excuse me, of religious and traditional peacemakers whose work focuses at least in part, on addressing the challenge of violent extremism. So as you see it, what role can religious actors play in addressing violent extremism? And can you cite some practical examples of their contributions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. I think, I have to start by saying that there is a clear recognition to the important role of religious leaders and actors, not only in countering violent extremism, but addressing a number of other issues as well. But for this topic, I see this recognition very clearly from the international communities to, different governments, and I see my friend Sean Casey is here. So this is recognition is that religious actors and leaders play a role in addressing these issues because they are in the front line. Today, we know that 80% of the population of the earth, associate themselves somewhere or another to religion. So basically, they have huge followers. In countering violent extremism, unfortunately, ideology and people who are committing these terrorist attacks, they also somehow associating themselves to religious places as well. So that's why we see the role of religious actors is very critical. And the recognition, my network was created because the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, realized that the role of religious actors and leaders is underutilized. Their potential is not utilized. That's why he called for a mechanism to further actually engage religious and traditional actors in many issues, and including countering violent extremism. Just last month in January, first week of January, I was in Somalia, a country that 90% of the population basically affiliated to Islam. And there is a huge problem of Al-Shabaab. So if you don't talk to these religious leaders, you will not be able to address Al-Shabaab crisis. So you have to involve them because, Al-Shabaab come to the mosque, Al-Shabaab go to social, basically places and all of that. So you have to talk to the religious leaders so that you have, kind of a mechanism to address these issues, whether it is an ideology that you wanted to put forward basically the right narrative of interpretation of theology or something like that. So you have to talk to religious leaders and actors. Also, I remember during Obama administration, the situation in Central African Republic. We worked closely with Sean's office as well. And because of the crisis there, because there is also was a concern that maybe Boko Haram will come to Central African Republic. So we have to engage religious actors and leaders in the country. But in collaboration with the U.S. government, Obama administration, at the time, we went to Central African Republic. We took religious leaders to talk to religious leaders on the ground to see how we can address issues of violent extremism, not only extremism that coming from specific religions, but the violence committed in that country is coming from both, Christian communities and Muslim communities. So it's important to address that issue. So that's why this role, we see it very critical. And we see the role critical if the role is not inclusive, it's not basically adding value. So we approach the issue of engaging religious actors in an inclusive way. What I mean is that we cannot ignore the role of women who are faith leaders as well. And I can cite you a number of examples that are proven to be the involvement of women of faith and faith leaders is very critical. Again, in Somalia, we don't hear about the piracies anymore today. Why? The reason is there is a specific leader of a specific country in the Gulf. He felt this situation needs to be addressed. He sent his special advisor to Somalia. And the special advisor was telling me directly, he traveled to Somalia 30 times, trying to find out what is the cause of this, what is drive actually Al-Shabaab to engage in this piracy, actions. He couldn't figure it out. He talked to the religious leaders, he talked to the youth, he talked to the government, he talked to many, members of society. He couldn't figure out. But he met with the mothers of the youth, of Al-Shabaab. So the mother told him it is a job for them. They get $50 a month because of doing this. He went back to his country, he reported to the president of that country, and the president told him, go and stop it. They created fishery companies, they employed all of these guys, and instead of $50, giving them $500, no piracy. So the point I'm making is that the role of the women's, faith leaders in addressing violent extremism is very critical.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to come back to the question of inclusiveness and religious engagement in a moment. I wanted, though, to stay with this broad theme of religious actors as contributors to preventing violent extremism, Hisham, but I wanted maybe with you to explore potentially some of the limitations to that approach. As we know, several governments in the Middle East today, in particular, have committed themselves very forthrightly to the cause of defeating extremist ideology. Some of them are some of the closest security partners of the United States. In some cases, they've also sought to offer or mobilize their own religious institutions as part of this endeavor. But I have to wonder, are these institutions and the religious scholars affiliated with them, are they actually credible voices for preventing and countering violent extremism?
So it's very good that you brought up that question and divided it into two, prevent and counter.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that the answer is different depending on that question. So when it comes to preventing, I think actually they might have more space, because preventing in that regard, influencing religious curricula, providing more in the sense of religious literacy, which makes it more difficult for recruitment from radical ideologues. I think that there's a case to be made for that. I'm not saying that that would be the case I would make, but I think there's a case there that can genuinely be made, and that there's an evidence base for that. If you have communities that have a sufficient level of religious literacy that they can identify, very peculiar, rabid, poor interpretations that then lend themselves to justifying violence, I think that there's a case to be made for that. It's the countering space that I'm less sanguine about, because I think in the countering space, you're trying to get at people who have already either become a problem or are very close to at risk of being a problem. And once they cross that threshold, in order for them to then realize or be convinced that what they have been led to believe by these different recruiters is actually not true, they need to view their interlocutors as credible. And I don't think that they will view them as credible unless those religious actors, to use your phrase, are able to demonstrate that they object not only to violence and abuse of all sorts of things to be bad when terrorist groups do this, but also when state actors do this. And unless they're able to show that, I worry that their credibility with that target audience is simply going to be shot.
So religious institutions that are perceived essentially as mouthpieces of the governments that are themselves the target of these groups.
Indeed. So, there are a number of different examples of governments within the Arab world and the wider region that I think are very concerned, for very legitimate reasons, of the spread of radical groups. Sometimes, for example, in the prisons. Okay, this is a legitimate concern, right? And then they send people into these places, trying to convince them that what they believe is wrong. They may well be right on the level of religious teaching and all of that. That's I don't dispute that, but I don't find it particularly likely that they're going to be paid attention to when they are sent there by the state, when this target audience already thinks that the state and everything to do with it is utterly bereft of any moral integrity and ethical value. And the only way for them to capture that is to be able to demonstrate that they also speak about abuses that are carried out by these states, which is very difficult because in most of these countries, and here I'm talking about a specific geography, right? I'm talking about the wider Middle East region. I don't know many places, there are a few, but I don't know many places where this is actually possible, to find religious actors and religious leaders that are critical of abuses by the state as well as by terrorist actors. There are very few like that because the space for developing that is so constricted and small. So I think this is a great limitation that unfortunately is not down to the religious leaders to change, because indeed if they were to embark in such exercises, they wouldn't last very long.
I hear you. I hear you. So Susie, I wanted to ask you to take us further down a path that Mohammed actually started a few moments ago. You know, when people talk about religious leaders, they tend to have in mind people who carry formal religious titles or who occupy, you know, specific positions in clerical or ecclesiastical hierarchies. And, you know, frankly, more often than not, they tend to be men, and they tend to be older men. And I know that in the work that you've done, you have really emphasized the importance of taking an inclusive approach to engaging religious actors to address violence and conflict. So I just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more to that imperative.
Yeah, and I will. I want to throw out one thing that we can come back to maybe in the question and answer too while it's churning around in my mind, which gets back to this question as well about ideology and the role it plays, because I think sometimes our fascination with or our focus on religious ideology and the role that it plays also then constrains the way that we engage with religious actors, where we tend to start and stop with religious actors and the messages that they can give, the narratives that they can give that can be good, the good religious antidote to the bad religious narratives or ideas that are out there. And so I often encourage our government actors to ensure that the ways in which they're engaging with religious actors goes beyond narratives as well, seeing them as social and political actors that can address a range of issues that have to do with the drivers of violence.
So the idea that the relevance and standing and stature and role of religious leaders in communities is not limited exclusively to the realm of theology or the spaces that we conventionally demarcate as religious, but they have broader influence and importance.
They can do a lot of mobilization in order to address issues of injustice, to address issues of economic inequality, to address issues of violence as it's felt by communities in their homes and in their streets and so on. And all of these contribute to larger patterns of violence. And so we need to think beyond religious actors simply as vehicles for the messages, the alternative messages, the counter messages, as part of our toolbox for ideological warfare, if you will. And if we're going to have a more robust religious engagement that's constructive, seeing the multiple roles that they play within society.
But Susan, maybe I want to, what about the resources? Do they have enough resources to address all of this, you know, multiple issues as religious actors?
Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It depends on which religious actors. It depends on if they're getting that. I think what you're getting at, though, is that they need more. They're often overlooked.
Because they might not be, they have enough capacity to address all of these variety of issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think historically they were often overlooked as potential players within civil society alongside some of the others in order to support peace building because of the secular biases and so on in the field. I think that shifted a lot. So there is more support that is being given to religious peace building broadly, religious engagement as part of violent extremism and so on. But again, especially when it comes to the latter, religious actors and religious engagement in violent extremism, I think the degree to which support is going for them to be able to do those kinds of things, it's very limited to the messaging, whether it's, you know, the messaging that they're doing within their religious communities via preaching or religious education, or social media. Sometimes there's religious actors in social media, but there needs to be a lot more robust, and so that's where they lack sometimes some of the resources. But there are incredible resources already indigenous to religious communities often, especially when it comes to things like mobilization of communities and the infrastructure that exists within religious communities to be able to draw on that. So they're able to do a lot with a little when it, with respect to aid and so on, I think, as well. So inclusion.
Please.
Okay, sorry. So one thing that worries me is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these extremist groups often have gendered narratives that tend to reinforce male domination, right? Male power, male authority. And that are seeking to reinforce what they see to be traditional gendered norms, gendered activities within their societies in ways that can really marginalize and disempower women in particular, but also, I think, have intergenerational repercussions as well for young people, and can actually fuel some of the cultural and ideological norms that create the conditions as well for sexual violence and other forms of violence that women and young people can face. And one thing that concerns me is that sometimes the ways in which governments or the international community goes about doing religious engagement actually can reinforce the assumption that it is men, and it is older men, who are the authorities within religious spaces. So when, and I believe it's unintended, right? But when governments come in and they're only or primarily engaging with the older male clerics in some of these activities, it can end up silencing, disempowering, just reinforcing that narrative that religion is the space of men, that religious beliefs, religious interpretations, religious ideas that's the purview of men to be able to do the interpretation and so on. But the reality, of course, on the ground is that women are incredibly involved in religious spaces, are very involved in shaping religious interpretation and behavior and attitudes, particularly within their local communities. But also women hold a great deal more traditional authority than we often recognize or see, whether that's nuns within the Catholic Church and the more formal roles of authority that they play in those spaces, but also women who are serving as religious scholars, who are trained in theology, in the Quran, in jurisprudence. So I want to make sure that we're also recognizing the formal role that women religious play, and not just the informal roles that they play as authorities as well. But what's important is that as we engage with religious actors in this work of violent extremism, that we ensure that we're including young people, we're including minorities, we're including women as a part of that, so that the process that we're using reflects the goal that we're seeking to achieve, right, in creating inclusive societies, and ones that respect the dignity of all people, and that are addressing some of these drivers of forms of sexual violence as well as larger structural forms of violence. And one thing that I think is particularly powerful about women religious in doing this work is that they're often, to get back to the ideological, if we're looking at challenging and transforming some of the religious ideas that justify legitimate violence or exclusion, women are hitting that, right? They're seeking to transform some of those and challenge some of those religious justifications of violence, at the same time that they're also seeking to address and transform some of the religious ideas or ideologies that are used in order to reinforce male domination over women. And so you get a twofer with women religious, right? They're transforming both forms of religious ideology that drives violence, which is more bang for your buck in some ways. And I also just want to point out my colleague, Pawasha Kakar at USIP, has been doing a lot of work recently to highlight the role that some of these women religious, not just mothers, but women religious who are trained in theology and and in religious history and jurisprudence and so on, the work that they're doing in order to engage directly with extremist actors. And they're often able to get access to these extremist actors, in part because they're women, so they're not seen as a threat. They're able to get around armed actors and checkpoints and so on. But then they use their religious authority and knowledge in order to negotiate directly with them for the release of hostages, in order to open up girls' schools in Afghanistan. This is women religious who have negotiated with the Taliban in order to open up girls' schools for education and so on. So they're using their religious authority precisely in order to have access to and to negotiate with some of these extremist actors in ways that are incredibly effective. But then, of course, the tragedy is then when the formal peace process, the peace talks happen, as they're happening now in Doha, those women aren't being included. Despite the fact that they've had these successes, they've had these experiences before, they're not there in Doha participating in that, unfortunately.
Taliban negotiation,
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn to the audience shortly, so please start getting your questions ready. But before doing so, I wanted to turn to you, Muhammad, one more time to explore another stereotype or trope that tends to circulate in these discussions. And it's the idea that certain variants of Islamic belief and practice, such as Sufism, are inherently apolitical and peaceful, whereas others, such as Salafism, are more prone to extremism and militancy. But then you find things in the world, right? Reality is always much messier than these categories allow. You see things in the world such as the fact that, some of the more prominent acts of political assassination in Pakistan in recent years, as well as the sort of heart of the outcry and the threats against the physical safety of Asia Bibi in Pakistan recently have come from the heart of the Barelvi Sufi establishment within Pakistan, and also with respect to Salafism. Much of it in the Middle East and elsewhere is politically quietist and very sort of loyal to regimes. So I just wonder, could you talk a little bit about how you see this discussion and debate?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, just before I address that issue, I want to also answer a question to Hisham about limitations of religious actors. And there are a number of limitations. I mean, one that I always highlight, and that's really the lack of safety and security of religious actors. Those particularly are speaking out against violent extremism. There is no mechanism for their safety and security. We probably rely on government and all of that, but that's not enough. Second, also, these religious actors and leaders in a number of countries, particularly in the Muslim countries, they're not free. They're not free in the sense that they don't have that freedom of expression, right? Because they really, they say whatever the regime want them to say, and that's really a problem. Somehow is also increasing this question of violent extremism. But your questions, in the dynamics in the Muslim world today, yes, it is true. There is that kind of different interpretation of Islam, different, even you find the Berkley in Pakistan, rallying against, Asia Bibi and all of that. I think there is a lack of education. There is no interaction between those who are, well-known, grounded Muslim scholars that understand the interpretation of Islam in the 21st century and the others. So there is no forum to have that kind of discussion today. Example of that, for instance, earlier the discussion was on Marrakesh Declaration was raised as a document that fits pretty well in Pakistan, for instance, because, the Christian communities or minority groups in Pakistan, they don't have the rights. And the argument coming from the other side is based on Islamic theology. But here we have an authentic Islamic theology that clearly saying that the practice of majority of the population is not aligned with authentic Islamic theology based on the Quran as well as the tradition of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So I think there is that lack of interaction and education, which is we see even people like Sufism or Berkley and others that tend to be more peaceful. You see them against as a baby, or they have their position on apostasy and blasphemy and all of that. On the other hand, we see all of that in the other part of the Muslim world. There is no mechanism today of discussion between hardcore Salafi group and other, basically well-grounded Muslim scholars that understand Islam today. A prominent Muslim scholar told me, I wish I will have the opportunity to have a discussion with the scholars in Saudi Arabia who are hardcore Salafis on the 10 commandments of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab to discuss these issues. Because a number of violent extremist groups actually based their violent act on those 10 commandments, which is basically, supported by some of the Salafi scholars. So these prominent scholars told me, I want that space so we can have that discussion. So the lack of that space, the lack of the freedom even of expression or to discuss these issues, basically contributing to what we see today. On inclusion, I have to say that the example of Morocco, I think something that needs to be lifted up in the Muslim world, particularly the description that Reverend Susan Hayward provided to us in the inclusion of women. Morocco today, with this called Murshidat, model, training women's religious actors on Islamic theology so that they can play multiple various roles in society. So I think that's something that is, I always tell the Muslim world that I wish you guys you adopt this model. It is a strong preventive measure.
Okay, thank you. I'm keen to get everyone else's voices into the conversation. I know some of you may want to respond to points that you're making, so maybe you could weave those responses into. So I think we have microphones available, so if you could raise your hands, if you could briefly identify yourself before posing your question, and then please pose an actual question, would be great. Sir.
Hi, my name is Erdogan Shipoli, and I'm a researcher on security and religion at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding here at Georgetown. My question will be something about the tools that we talked about, fighting religious extremism, and maybe Susan, this is something more related to you. So if you ask me, or if I ask you about the tools that we have developed, or maybe USIP in particular has developed to fight Islamic religious extremism, there are things that you can say that I can say and stuff like that, but I'm wondering if with the rise of Christian right, for example, are there such tools developed for fighting other religious extremism, or are we, have we learned that yet, that we need to develop those kind of tools? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Should I answer that?
Yeah, please. So
one of the reasons the religion program at USIP is actually the oldest thematic program at USIP. It was created in 1989, and we have David Little here, who was actually involved in the founding of the religion program here. And one of the things that drew me to it was the fact that it predated 9/11. So it didn't have a myopic focus and obsession with Islam, but was actually looking at multiple forms of religious violence. It was looking at forms of Christian extremism in Nigeria or in Uganda. It was looking at forms of Hindu nationalism or Buddhist violence in Sri Lanka, and was taking more of a equal representation approach to understanding religion, and then looking at how to engage with religious actors also across these different religious traditions. in order to support peace. So I would say like we're doing some of the things that we're doing, for example, in Myanmar and Sri Lanka in order to address some of the forms of Buddhist extremism or Buddhist nationalism or Buddhist exclusionary ideas and so on, are similar but with slightly different contextual and religious and so on nuances. But they're things like doing peace education within religious schools that take some of the traditional Western concepts of analyzing conflict and transforming conflict and bringing it into conversations with the Buddhist principles, Buddhist understandings of what the causes of conflict are and how to support peace building, and having discussions about diversity and coexistence and what Buddhism history and teachings have to offer about living with a religious other. So those are the same kinds of things that we're doing in places where there are forms of Islamic justified violence or exclusion in working within the religious schools there on Islamic peace education. And similarly on the work that we've done in Nigeria that's working with Muslim and Christian, male and female religious actors on building, on mitigating against the forms of extremism within Christianity and within Islam that manifest in Nigeria, building interfaith relationships and reconciliation in the aftermath of violence and as a preventative measure, creating networks of youth and religious actors who can respond when tensions are rising between religious communities. There's some incredible women religious leaders who are leading efforts there in partnership with security actors to try to mitigate against forms of extremism and the effects that they're having in their community. And again, when I say extremism here, I mean forms of course, there's Boko Haram, but there's also forms of Christian extremism and Christian-driven, Christian legitimated violence, particularly against the Muslim community there, that they're addressing as well. So yes, there are tools and there are ways that we're looking at the multiple forms of religious violence around the world.
Thank you. So next on the list is Jose Casanova down in the front of the room here.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about interreligious alliances and interreligious conflicts. Because if we look at the world today, we see two very different alternatives. One is that of alliances, very clearly, among religious groups fighting their common enemies, which basically are declared to be secularism, liberalism, feminism. And there is a lot of religious groups that feel that this is their main threat. And this leads to, we see the coalition between evangelical Christian right and the Moscow Patriarchate and the traditionalist Christians in Europe. And then we saw about 2 weeks ago, the visit of the Pope to the United Arab Emirates, in which the emphasis is precisely on issues of fraternity, looking for issues of social justice, issues of immigration. So, I mean, those are fundamental, as you point out. It's not only a question of the religious message, as you, Susan, but precisely the other issues in which religious leaders can also play a role in the community. And so, if we are seeing these two as fundamental alternatives in the narratives about religion in the modern world. So I just want you to address these two problematic options we have at the global level of coalitions of religious leaders. And,
Thank you, Jose. Hisham, do you want to take that, and then we can see if Susie...
I would. A few things, really. First, that's a wonderful question, and I think it brings up several very good points that ought to be addressed and are very often ignored. First, just a slight comment about the papal visit. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, simply because it was presented as such a unique occasion. It was not a unique occasion. The Catholic Pope has been to many parts of the Arab world in the last few years, is going to Morocco next month. And the Orthodox Pope has been on the Arabian Peninsula quite a few times, etc. And I felt very uncomfortable, frankly, about how it was presented, because it implied that it was so unique that it meant that actually interreligious tolerance in the Arab world is abysmal. And I don't think that's true, and I think that that really escapes the history that has a very long pedigree in the region. So it's an interesting example of how ignorance of certain things can be misrepresented. But on the alliances, I find this very interesting, particularly within the West. So you have, for example, the suggestion of an alliance between different religious groups precisely because of things like secularism and a loss of respect for the sacred, and the absence of a religious feeling in the public sphere, etc. And thinking that, oh, okay, in that case, there can be these alliances between these different types of religious communities. For example, someone like John Milbank or Roger Scruton in the United Kingdom. There's only one problem with this, which is that they happen to have extremely problematic views on other religious communities. Roger Scruton and John Milbank, they speak a lot about secularism and about the loss of the sacred and so on. They also have extremely poor views on Muslim communities within the West and beyond. Right? And these are then overlooked in order to establish some greater alliance. This is very problematic. And as we have these discussions, the rise and influence of anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia is very often overlooked, and I think that's important for us to call out. It infests, frankly, a good portion of our public discussion, whether we speak about it or not. When politicians from certain backgrounds say certain things and then are attacked in ways that they never would have been if they were not of that particular religious tradition. So the alliances aspect, I think, is something to be problematized. For us to really get at the root of this, it's not simply about, oh, there's a loss of transcendence in the public sphere, so then everything else can be put to one side, because it feeds into this dynamic where I think communities get put into a very problematic situation at a time when the far right is rising in terms of being mainstreamed, and that has real life effects on the ground with people.
Susie or Mohammed, would either of you like to?
I'll defer so there can be more time for questions.
I just want to, I slightly basically have a different opinion regarding the papal visit, and disagree with Hisham a little bit here. I think it was a step forward. That's the way I look into it. It is something that is historic in the Gulf states, and I'm really not looking into the small population of the citizens of the Gulf, but I'm looking into the tens of millions of Christians and Catholic in particular living in that part of the world. With this visit, I think it is very critical to recognize their rights also to have, a public mass with 150,000 people and all of that. So I think it's, of course, there is a political gain from a number of countries, including UAE and the Egyptians, the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Al-Azhar projected himself with the leader of the Muslim world, equivalent to the Pope. So we can talk about these things, but I think toward the progress of interreligious, basically dialogue or participation, it is something significant, and we need to recognize that there are limitations, no question about it, but we have to recognize the significance of it.
To that end, I asked my brother Mohammed, who was there, I said, how many people in the room were women? And what was your answer?
Well, yes, you asked me, I answered maybe 5 to 10% max, in that when they signed the documents. Yeah, fraternity of, something. So.
Yeah. Mohammed, why is it any more significant than, this same Pope has been to Egypt, he's been to Jordan.
Why he's going to Morocco next month.
He's going to Morocco. Why was this moment?
I'm talking about the Gulf states. I'm not talking about the wider Middle East, to Morocco. How many, Christians in Morocco? How many of them?
Okay,
but how many millions of Christians? But how many millions of Christians, Catholic, in the Gulf states? They are at some stage. They don't allow them even to build a church. They don't allow them even to worship in some places.
But this isn't the case in the UAE.
Well, it's not the case in the UAE, but the message to the neighboring countries as well. We shouldn't ignore that.
The Orthodox Pope has been.
Yeah,
to
the
these
Orthodox
different-
Pope,
has
but
been
we are
to these
talking
different
about the
countries,
Catholic popes
actually,
here.
Indeed. But here's the issue that I think is very, very important for us to remember in terms of presenting the visit. When we go to the point of establishing it as, I'm not saying it's not significant. This is true.
Right.
But it's not about the significance simply as being significant, but it's the extent of that significance. Because when we overplay its significance, then I think we then declare that actually there was no religious tolerance, that the interreligious dimension of what is life in the broader Arab, as well as within the GCC part of the world, is actually completely absent. That's the problem that I have with this. Not that,
Extraordinary.
yeah, it was significant. It was not extraordinary.
Right.
And there are political reasons for that, of course.
Of course, I mean, you
which
and
you
I
recognize,
agree.
which you recognize,
Yeah,
of course. But I think that that's important because the way in which this then gets played into other discussions, right? Because while this is going on, you also have different political actors far beyond the Arab world, nothing to do with not within that part of the world, arguing for the excusal of autocracy and authoritarianism in a number of different countries. I'm thinking particularly of Syria and Bashar al-Assad on the basis of, well, he's kind to Christians. And we've seen this increasingly over the last few years within the UK, on the European continent, probably within the United States as well, increasingly so. And I think we have to be very careful about this.
So we've got time for one more question. The gentleman in the back there had his hand up. Please. There's a microphone, sir.
Thank you. My name is Michael Azefo. I'm originally from Cameroon. I was educated by Jesuit priests. But when I came to this country, the Catholic mission was basically a middle leftist organization fighting a lot for people's rights. It is no longer that. I'm asking the panel, to what
Sir, could you speak
extent-
into the microphone?
to what
Otherwise we can't
extent
hear
do
you.
they believe that those who pontificate for the different religions actually profess the doctrine of that religion? Because I asked this question in relation to the debate about the Pope's visit to that. The country where I came from, the popes have been to Cameroon I don't know how many times. And the Cameroon dictatorship has been to the Vatican I don't know how many times. But that does not stop the violence that we now have in that country. Same thing here. The bishops here have switched to a policy that doesn't look like the Catholic Church that was in the United States in 1985 when I came here.
Who would like to?
I don't understand the question.
I mean, I think the really important thing is that these elite initiatives can't stay at the elite level. They can have symbolic importance and significance and so on, but if it's not translating down and responsive to what's happening on the ground, then it can actually end up sometimes even creating more of a backlash if it doesn't lead to change. We were discussing earlier today the declaration culture. So when there's these elites come together and sign these declarations that often have very visionary, inclusive, inspiring language as a component of them. But then when years pass and the declaration just sort of gathers dust on the shelf, it actually ends up creating more cynicism among some community members who don't see that declaration in the vision in that declaration coming true for them in their day-to-day lives. So I think the important thing, if I'm understanding your question correctly, Michael, is that those elite initiatives, like what we saw in the UAE and so on, actually translate into actions on the ground and also are responsive to the desires and the needs and the visions of the communities as well.
Okay, great.
Could I add one thing to that?
Please.
So this was set out under Chatham House rules, so I don't think that I can repeat too many of the details, but one of the suggestions was that against the background of elite pronouncements like this, stuff happens in the background. that we are not necessarily made aware of that might improve the condition for certain communities on the ground. I don't think, by the way, that was behind the papal visit, because again, I think within the UAE, that type of interreligious tolerance is well established and has been for a long time. But that might not be the case necessarily when other high-profile events of that nature take place in other countries. The problem is they're very difficult to assess because by their very nature, they're quiet, right? Having said that, all too often, we were talking about this declaration culture earlier, all too often there are these big, grand events. And by the way, they're not just with religious actors, they're with political actors, they're with all sorts of different civil society actors that they come together, they make grand proclamations, but then there isn't follow-up. And the follow-up is grunt work. The follow-up is stuff that happens on the ground, takes a lot of time and effort, doesn't have fanfare, isn't in front of the cameras, doesn't have huge amount of resources put towards it. And Mohammed brought this up earlier. Do they have the resources to do what we expect them to do, or what we're demanding that they do? And I'm not convinced that they do, unfortunately.
So this is a set of issues that the Berkley Center is going to continue to work on. We hope to be doing a series of convenings around these questions and debates. And so if you're interested in this topic, please make sure that you tune in to the Berkley Center and its products and its listserv. I want to thank all of you for being with us this evening. I hope you won't run away too quickly because we have a reception outside, and hope you'll stay with us for that. But I wanted to end by thanking our panelists for giving us such a fantastic set of things to take home and cogitate on. So Hisham, Susie, Mohammed, thank you very much.
And thanks to all of you.
Thank you.